The first snow came early that year, biting and sharp, riding in on a wind that curled under doors and through the gaps in every settler's siding. By the second day of November, a thick white crust blanketed the ridges above the valley, and the cattlemen had already started losing calves. It wasn't just early, it was strange. A dry, brittle, cold air that cut without moisture. Fires burned fast and gave up quick. Even the old-timers squinted at the sky like they'd seen something off about it, and the younger men, ones who'd laughed through last year's freeze, started stacking firewood like sinners at confession. But none of them, not one, spared a second glance for the odd silver curve in the pines west of town, except to mock it. "Built herself a pig trough," they said at Harper's store. "More like a damn grain silo," said another, slapping his knee. It stood like a half-buried barrel, corrugated metal from end to end, half sunken into the hillside like it had been dropped by mistake from a train. Where the other cabins were square, proud, and sharp-edged, built from logs or cut boards with windows framed by lace or rusted cans lined up like trophies, hers was smooth and strange. A low arch of steel, no chimney, no porch, just a door flush with the curve, bolted shut, and smoke rising from a pipe that stuck out sideways like a broken gun barrel. The widow who built it? She didn't laugh back. She didn't say anything at all. Her name was Martha Fay Dunley, 41, short, broad-shouldered, and slow-spoken when she bothered to speak at all. Most folks still called her Elias's woman, even though Elias Dunley had been buried 5 years to the day. Rattlesnake bite, deep in a canyon no preacher would follow. He'd left her a rotting log cabin with no floor and half a roof, and she'd lived in it 3 years longer than anyone could stomach watching, until one spring she'd hauled out the last of the boards, torn the thing to pieces with nothing but a pry bar in her own arms, and started hammering something round. "I seen her bringing in pipe, bent metal, bolts, sheet iron," said Mr. Reardon from the mill, peering through his pince-nez like he could measure sin. "That ain't no way to keep heat." No one helped her, not when the rain came and turned her hillside to slick clay, and she slipped with a heavy beam and cracked her ribs. Not when she worked through July with blood on her palms and her ankle wrapped with rags. And certainly not when the first frost fell and she was still hammering bolts into a frame that looked like it belonged on a battlefield more than a farm. But she finished it. Late September, without fanfare, she sealed the door shut, covered the arch with pine sap and cloth to keep the seams tight, and disappeared inside with 2 goats, a rack of smoked venison, and 3 cords of willow she'd split herself. A week later, the first of the real cold came, and the valley began to buckle. No one worried at first. Winters in the valley had always been survivable. Tough, yes, but predictable. Folks had their root cellars and their iron stoves and their stories about the '89 freeze when 3 men died trying to start a fire in a blizzard. It gave them something to lean on, like calluses passed down from their fathers. But this wasn't that kind of winter. 3 days into the storm, roofs began to groan. The wood cabins, even the newer ones with tight seams and double walls, started dripping from nails that turned to icicles overnight. Chimneys cracked, kindling wouldn't catch. Children coughed in their sleep while mothers stuffed every crack with rags and prayed to feel the faintest draught of heat. By the 6th day, temperatures fell to numbers none of them could track, 70 below, by guess. Oil froze in lamps, water turned solid in cups left by the hearth. One man burned his porch furniture to keep his daughter from crying. Another tried to kill a chicken and found it frozen stiff in its coop. And all the while, that curved silver hut sat like a mystery in the pines, with a line of smoke curling sideways and never once flickering out. They started asking questions. At first it was just murmurs. "She's still in there? I seen light, just faint, day before yesterday. You think she's warm? She can't be." But the silence from inside made them nervous. Martha had always been strange, but never cruel, never closed off. She used to sell goat cheese at the store, used to bring eggs wrapped in cloth. Now she was a ghost with smoke rising from her roof. On the 10th night, the mail rider froze to death just 3 miles outside of town. They found him upright, one hand on the reins, the other trying to strike a match. He'd made it to the crest above the widow's hut, seen it, maybe even tried to reach it, but he'd never knocked. That's when it shifted. That's when the laughter stopped. Suddenly, every man who'd jeered at the round hut started wondering aloud if maybe she'd had something right, that maybe her war shed or storm barrel, as they'd joked, actually worked. And if it did, maybe she'd let someone in, maybe just for a night. "Someone's gotta ask," said Clem Dorsey, a blacksmith with frostbitten fingers wrapped in oil rags. "We got 3 babies sick. We're burning flour sacks. She's in there warm. I just know it." They sent Mrs. Wilker first, an old woman, no threat, with tears freezing on her cheeks, and a child bundled against her chest. She walked slow, crunching over frozen brush, and knocked once on the round steel door. No answer. Twice. No answer. She knocked a third time and called out, voice hoarse, "Please, Martha, just for the baby." The door opened, not wide, just enough, and heat spilled out like something alive. The girl inside was wrapped in wool and asleep in a basket by a glowing stove that didn't smoke or hiss or creak. The air inside the hut was dry, still, no drafts, no visible source of woodpile or vent. The curved walls glowed faint orange from reflected heat. Mrs. Wilker wept, and Martha, silent as ever, motioned her in. The next morning, 2 more came, then 6, then half the town. By the week's end, they stood in lines, trembling and silent, waiting their turn to ask, not to be taken in, just to feel it, just to press their fingers to the door and remind their bones what warmth had once felt like. She let them in, one at a time, but she never said much, just ladled broth and gave them blankets to hold for a minute or two. The silence inside the hut was sacred. Some cried, others offered to pay her. She always refused, and when they left, they went home different, ashamed, because they'd mocked her, called her mad, said she'd built a tin coffin. But the storm wasn't easing, it was getting worse, and the only place left in the valley that hadn't cracked, broken, or burned through its wood was the silver hut, buried halfway in pine. She'd built something none of them understood, something that held heat like a miracle, something that refused to die. And now, the real test was coming, because the river had frozen solid, and the snow was waist-deep by morning. A cabin on the north slope had caved in. A baby girl had died in her sleep. And Martha, quiet, stubborn Martha, was still alone in that hut, still opening the door to strangers, and still not explaining a damn thing. They needed more than just shelter now. They needed to know how. The storm didn't break, it deepened. By mid-December, there was no mail, no telegraph. The road east was impassable, the trails gone under 4 feet of dry, biting snow that refused to melt even in full sun. Snowdrifts swallowed fences, trees bent until they snapped like bones, chickens froze in their coops, pigs in their pens. One man tried to butcher a steer and found the animal frozen so solid the blade snapped in his hand. Folks started burning seed stock, heirlooms, barn doors, anything that would catch. And still, that silver hut in the pines glowed. It wasn't glowing with fire, not the kind of orange flicker you'd see in windows from cabins too close to the edge. It was duller, rounder, like coals in a stove that never went out. The pipe at the rear still breathed smoke, slow, steady. Every morning, every night, the widow hadn't left in weeks. They started calling it the shell, like it was alive, like it was something she'd grown rather than built. A strange, hard thing around her, and nobody could figure it out. Some guessed she'd lined it with fire brick or stacked rocks on the inside, like a kiva. Others said she must have built a stove from scrap boiler tanks and rigged a kind of closed draft flue that didn't bleed heat like theirs did. But all of it was just talk. No one knew. Only a handful had ever been let inside, and none of them had seen the whole thing. One woman claimed the walls were double-layered with sheep's wool in between. Another swore she saw a second door inside, like a pocket with quilts hanging between like layers of skin. But whatever it was, the truth sat hidden under snow and metal and silence. Then a boy died, Jonas Kepler, 10 years old, pale, smart, and always too small for his age. His father had tried to build a windbreak from hay bales, but the wind got behind them and froze the walls from the inside. The stove never caught. The child went to sleep and didn't wake. His mother found him stiff, eyes open, his lips were blue, and her hands shook when she carried him out. The town snapped. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something lower, heavier, like guilt that had been frozen and was starting to thaw. A quiet panic that the rules they'd lived by, the same cabins, the same stoves, the same root cellars dug with pride, were no match for this new kind of cold. So when Mr. Reardon, the very man who'd mocked the widow's hut, the loudest, came trudging through the square with his arm in a sling and his breath fogging so heavy it hung like smoke, no one laughed when he said, "I'm going to ask her how she built it." No one offered to go with him either. He made the walk at dusk, wind in his face, snow up to his knees. The last mile took him an hour. He fell twice. By the time he reached the curved metal door, his nose had bled and frozen twice over. He knocked once. She didn't answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then he just leaned against the door and shouted. Not mean, not begging, just truth. "Martha, it's killing us." The door creaked open, and she stood there, candle behind her, steam rising from the warmth like breath off a horse's back. Her eyes were red. Her coat was wool, stitched with patches. Her boots were thick, laced over pants, not a dress. And when he stepped inside, he nearly dropped to his knees. It was warm, not just survivable. Warm, the kind of warmth that made your Lungs hurt after too many weeks without it. That made your knees shake and your hands sting with returning blood. He tried to ask questions, but she motioned him to the bench near the stove, poured water from a kettle that hadn't stopped simmering in weeks, and handed him a rag to press to his face. He wept into it. After an hour, she opened the door again and told him to go home, said only this: "Don't ask for my plans, just build smart." And she handed him a drawing. It was nothing but a side profile, a curve, an air gap, a double wall, a few measurements, no labels, just enough for a man like Reardon to see the logic, to understand. He returned that night like a prophet, holding the paper like it was scripture. Double wall barrel vault, air gap between, steel ribs sunk in frost line. Inner shell has stove flue drawn through vent shaft instead of up. Heat circulates, no corners, no drafts, doesn't leak, doesn't bleed. What about insulation? Someone asked. She used wet clay and goat hair, Reardon said. Stuffed the whole gap. Clay hardens. Hair binds it. No rot, no mold. That's why it's warm. They looked at him like he'd read from a foreign book. But it made sense. Too much sense. And suddenly all the old pride started to sour in their mouths. Because they could have done it too. They'd had sheet metal, goat hair, clay, brains. But they'd chosen straight walls, square corners, and stoves that leaked half their heat out the pipe. Because that's how cabins were supposed to look. Because God forbid a widow build something curved. By morning, men were tearing apart sheds and digging for old pipe. Some tried to copy her plans. Others knocked again at her door, asking for second chances, for closer looks, for help. She didn't open it again, not to anyone. The smoke still curled from the pipe. The soft glow still flickered behind the slit of her window, but her silence returned like a wall. Mrs. Wilker said it was because of Jonas. She held that boy's hand, she whispered one morning. After he was already gone, I saw her, sat on her knees and wept into his coat. The guilt deepened. Soon a quiet rule emerged. No one knocked on her door unless it was life or death. No one asked for more than a glance. She became something close to sacred. Not a witch, not a saint, just someone they'd wronged who'd survived. Weeks passed. The town changed. They dug out root cellars and replaced beams with curved ribs. One man tore off his roof entirely and began building a barrel vault from scrap tin and horse lashing. Another, Clem Dorsey, abandoned his home entirely and tried to build into the hillside like hers. But the cold didn't stop to wait for their revisions. January brought winds sharp enough to strip bark from trees. A cabin on the west ridge caught fire after a stovepipe cracked. 2 men dead. A woman miscarried in her sleep because the straw under her had frozen to the floorboards. Babies coughed blood. Windows shattered from frost expansion. The water in the town well was solid as bone, and still Martha's hut stood, unchanged, undamaged, unafraid. It became a kind of compass. Men would watch the smoke from her pipe each morning, just to see if it still rose. Some would mark the time it started, 6:40 a.m., like clockwork. Others said they could smell cedar and goat hair on the breeze when the wind turned. One night a fireball streaked across the sky. Just a meteor, they'd later say. But folks woke and thought the world was ending. Mothers screamed, horses tore loose, the children cried and prayed. And Martha's smoke? It still rose. The hut became myth, even as she still walked it. They saw her once every few weeks, quiet, cloaked, head down, fetching water from a break in the creek ice only she seemed to know about. Once, someone saw her dragging a sled with branches for kindling. Another time, she left a bundle of dried meat at the church door without a note. No one ever followed her. Not anymore. She'd passed beyond that. And then the thaw came. Not quickly, not evenly, but enough. Late February, sun finally broke through. Snow sagged and dripped. Ice cracked from rooftops, and the wells began to moan with fresh water. The first birds returned, early, confused, but there. The town emerged changed, half its cabins ruined, 3 families dead. Every man older than 40 looked suddenly closer to 60, but they were alive, most of them, and not because of what they'd known, because of what they'd mocked, because of her. They didn't build monuments, they didn't gather for speeches. But a new hut appeared near the river that spring, curved, double-walled, made from scraps and sealed with clay. Then another, then 2 more. By summer's end, nearly a third of the town had built some version of what Martha had shown them. The laughter never came back. And when a trader rode in from the east with spring goods and asked about the strange silver hut in the pines, no one laughed. They only said this: she built it to survive. We laughed, and she let us in anyway. But no one mentioned the drawing. No one mentioned how warm it had stayed. They understood now. Some things are too sacred to sell. By the time April thawed the valley enough for grass to show, it was clear the winter had drawn a line through the town, not just between the living and the dead, but between before and after. The cabins that still stood bore deep scars, warped timbers, scorched hearths, and glass replaced with oiled cloth. Every household had lost something: a child, a finger, a neighbor, a home, and not one soul spoke the same way anymore. The widow's hut still stood, unblemished. When the first travelers passed through on foot, two pale Swedes staggering from the high pass, faces sunburned, packs nearly empty, they were brought into town like survivors from a war. One of them, speaking broken English, said the northern ridges were impassable and full of graves. He'd seen entire cabins blackened from the inside out, men dead inside with their fingers still on frozen matches. He also said he saw a silver shell glowing in the pines. When someone told him she was alive, he knelt on the saloon floor and crossed himself. The town didn't hold church services that spring. The preacher's wife had died in January, and he'd taken to walking the woods in silence, holding a Bible but never opening it. Faith had grown quieter, more private, less about hymnals and more about what could be built with your own hands, less about salvation, more about survival. And everywhere you looked, you saw signs of what had changed. Men who used to brag about axe skills were now asking how to shape steel. Women who'd once embroidered window lace were learning how to heat seal wool against drafts. Young boys began studying her curve, that curve, in the new huts, tracing it with their fingers and whispering, "She knew!" Martha didn't speak of it. She didn't come down for spring market or attend the makeshift wakes held for the dead. She didn't answer when 3 families sent letters with loaves of bread or baskets of eggs. She didn't leave her hut for days at a time. But when she did walk through town, her silence didn't feel cold. It felt earned. It was mid-May before someone finally asked aloud what the rest had been thinking for weeks. "Should we build her a house?" It was Clem Dorsey who said it, standing near the charred remains of his old forge. He wasn't offering charity. He was trying to pay a debt. "She's still living in that tin cave like it's a punishment," he added. "We could raise her something proper." Right, but that word, proper, hung thick in the air, because proper had failed, proper had frozen, proper had buried children and broken bones, and cracked every roof in town. And what she had built, the hut they all once called foolish, had not. So the blacksmith's offer didn't stick, not out of malice, not from pride, but because the town had begun to suspect that it wasn't Martha Faye Dunley who needed their help. It was them who still had something to learn. The hut itself began to take on a kind of legendary quality. Travelers who passed through on the way to Larkspur or deeper into the Divide would often ask to see it. Some even offered money. One man, a banker from Cheyenne with snow still on his sleeves and a fancy leather satchel, offered her $25 just to sketch it. She didn't open the door, just left him standing there until the wind turned and he stomped off red-faced and muttering. Others left gifts at her threshold: blankets, canned beans, books, shoes. Some carved small wooden figurines of her hut, tiny curved shells on sticks that looked like beetles or tortoisebacks. Children began tracing its outline in the dirt while they played. A few drew the shape on walls with charcoal, like it was a sacred glyph. But no one else was allowed inside. She hadn't opened the door since Reardon, and it was gnawing at people. Some began to wonder if maybe the truth of it wasn't as simple as a double wall or goat hair insulation. Maybe she'd done something darker, something stranger, something unholy. There were whispers, faint but growing. That kind of heat don't come from firewood alone. "I heard she used blood in the clay," she mutters at night. Saw her once talking to the snow. But these were spoken by cowards, quietly, and never twice, because there wasn't a single soul in the valley who hadn't stood near her hut at some point in the dark and thought, "If I knock, will she answer? And will it be warm inside?" The mystery began eating into them, the way hunger does, not of the belly but the spirit. One night the apothecary's apprentice, young Robert, bright and too curious for his own good, snuck up to her hut while she was gone for water. He'd heard stories that there was a second chamber beneath the hut, a tunnel, a dugout like a mine that fed heat upward. He brought a pry bar. He waited until the smoke stopped curling, until the moon was high and she was halfway down the slope, sled trailing behind her. Then he crept to the rear of the hut, where the ground dipped and the metal met the dirt. He started digging. 3 minutes in, he hit something solid, not rock, not pipe, a second layer of steel. Just as he tapped the bar against it again, a shadow fell over him. It was her. She didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice. She just stood there, breath curling like smoke, and said, "You'll freeze your soul long before you freeze your bones." Robert dropped the bar. The next day, he cut his hair, burned his journal, and didn't speak for a week. Whatever he saw in her face that night, he never told. And after that, the town stopped wondering aloud. They just watched, waited, and kept building. By July, there were 6 curved huts in town, all different, some with thinner steel, some with canvas stretched over bent willow, but all inspired by her design. And something strange happened. They worked. One family said their stove burned half the wood and twice as hot. Another said their walls didn't sweat during the night for the first time in 20 years. One old man, who'd fought every suggestion of change since the town was built, wept when he walked into the one his son had built him. "It's warm all the way to the ground," he whispered, "like a mother's lap." The town began to breathe easier, but with comfort came questions. What if the next winter was worse? What if they hadn't learned enough? What if Martha left? That last one terrified them. So Clem and Reardon and Mrs. Wilker gathered one Sunday, no preacher, just 3 chairs in the schoolhouse, and wrote a letter. "Dear Mrs. Dunley, this town owes you more than words can hold. We laughed when we should have listened. We ignored what we feared. You kept our babies alive. You showed us a way through. We won't ask to enter your home, but if there's more to learn, teach us. Please. Yours in debt and gratitude, Evermore Township." They left the letter nailed to a tree outside her hut, not at the door, not near the smoke pipe, just out of reach. 3 days passed, no answer. Then, on the 4th morning, when the sun finally broke through clean and bright and the frost had melted off the high ridge, they found something strange in the square. A bundle, wrapped in thick cloth, tied with goat sinew. Inside, sketches, detailed and clean. Every part of her hut, drawn by hand, notes in the margins, calculations, airflow diagrams, instructions for wall composition, a full schematic from foundation to ceiling. There was no name on the bundle, but everyone knew. They made copies, bound them in leather. One was sent to Denver, where it disappeared in a sea of mailbags. Another to Cheyenne, where a merchant tried to sell it to a railroad company. But in Evermore, it was placed in the town's small library, nailed to the back wall with a note, "This saved us. Don't forget who did it." From then on, the town marked its seasons by her hut. When the first frost came, they watched for smoke. When the river froze, they watched for her footprints. And every time her door opened and someone saw the faint orange glow behind it, it reminded them that warmth was not just about heat. It was about knowing how to hold it. And Martha Faye Dunley had held it through the worst freeze any of them had lived to see. Not with magic, not with prayer, but with steel, with clay, with bloodied hands and silence. And when winter came again, colder than the last, it found them ready, because they'd mocked a widow's Nissen hut, and she'd saved them anyway. The second winter didn't come with howling winds or a sudden drop in temperature. It came quietly, a calm, creeping kind of cold, the kind that slithered under door frames before anyone noticed. It lingered in the roots of the trees, hid in the corners of outhouses, settled on the inside of windows like frost breath. The air never snapped, like it had the year before. It tightened, slowly, like a noose no one could feel until they were already too short of breath to protest. By mid-November, the Evermore Valley saw frost every night, and sun no higher than the ridge by noon. The cattle didn't move much. Horses nickered low in their throats and stood still too long in the snow. The children no longer played by the stream. It had frozen in October. The creek bed cracked like old bone underfoot. But the difference this year wasn't just in the cold. It was in the cabins. Round, arched, smaller, more efficient. Curved roofs of tin, sheet metal, or even sapling-bent thatch sealed over with tar and goat hair. Every one a distant cousin of the widow's hut, some better built than others, but everyone warmer, stronger, still standing. No one mocked them now, not even the ones still living in square cabins, who now spent most of their time inside the round homes of neighbors with a little more foresight. And the widow? She was still in the same place, still in the hut tucked into the hillside like a bullet lodged under flesh, still quiet, solitary. The only change was the door. Once a plain metal sheet bolted shut, it now bore a symbol carved with a knife, 3 concentric curves, like ripples in water or the echo of a distant voice. It became a kind of unofficial seal. When a neighbor carved it into a gatepost, no one questioned it. Then someone else burned it into a bread paddle. Another painted it in soot above their stove. The shape became a sign of warmth, of survival, of her, and that meant it became something else to outsiders. By midwinter, news of Evermore's strange huts had traveled. Word had crossed the plains, moved down through Colorado territory and reached traders and miners in places the locals had never even heard of, places where men huddled in tunnels, entire towns swept away in ice storms, and no one could explain how a widow in a tin shell had made it through a storm that killed horses on their feet. So they came. First it was 1 man from Buena Vista, then 3 more from Leadville, a surveyor from New Mexico, a wagoner who'd lost 2 fingers in the freeze, riding a mule with frost-burned ears, a woman with a baby strapped to her chest and calluses down to the bone. They all came looking for the same thing, not handouts, not even shelter, knowledge. They wanted to see the hut, to touch it, to ask her how. The town didn't turn them away. They fed them, let them warm their hands, pointed to the curve of steel in the pines, but none dared approach the door anymore, not unless invited. There was a reverence to it now, a sense that you waited to be chosen. So it surprised the town when, one morning in the Dead of January, smoke didn't rise from the widow's stovepipe. Not once, not at all. By noon, 4 men had gathered at the rise, boots crunching in powder, staring at the hut. Could be nothing, Clem muttered. Could be everything, Mrs. Wilker said from behind him. By dusk, a decision was made. They would knock, just once. Reardon walked the final yards alone, scarf around his face, knees stiff from age and fear. He raised his hand, hesitated, and then noticed something strange. The door wasn't latched. It was slightly open. He pushed it in slowly, and what he saw made him stop cold. The hut was empty, not just of Martha, of everything. No stove, no cots, no cloth-covered walls, no goat hair stuffing, no food, no water, no trace of a woman having ever lived there. Just the curved shell of metal, still warm to the touch, as if it had only recently been abandoned. Even the drawings she'd once shared, the originals, were gone from where she'd hung them in a narrow slit between wall beams. Gone, all of it. Reardon stood in that warmth for a long moment, breathing. Then he turned back toward town, where the cold waited like a held breath. Martha Fay Dunley was gone. No footprints, no wagon ruts, no note, no sign of struggle, not a thread or a hair left behind. She had vanished with the same quiet resolve with which she had lived, but now it didn't. The town of Evermore, high in the valley, forgotten by most maps, weathered the storm in silence and in warmth. Not one home lost its roof, not one baby froze, and when the snow melted, the only thing the settlers had to sweep from their doorways was a little wet pine ash and tracks from where the dogs had come and gone. Because every structure now bore the same basic shape, curved, seamless, tight, the widow's shape. They didn't call them Nissen huts anymore. That term faded, replaced by a dozen local names: coil houses, snow shells, Martha domes. But everyone knew the truth, even if her name no longer appeared in the headlines of the trade papers or the scrawled notes left in packages traveling west. She had changed the cold itself, not by resisting it, not by hiding from it, but by understanding it, by building around its logic instead of pretending it could be fought like a bear or a bandit. There was power in that, a quiet, enduring kind, and it spread, first to towns 2 ridges over, then to whole camps of railway men who'd burn their ties just to survive. They copied what they saw, sometimes poorly, but even the poorest imitations saved lives. And still, no one had seen Martha Fay Dunley again. No word, no letters, no sightings. She had left no grave, no kin, no final record. Just the warmth she'd made real, and the silence she'd trusted it to carry on without her. But stories filled the gaps. Some claimed she'd crossed into Arizona territory and built another hut somewhere deep in the Painted Desert, helping a family of ranchers whose child was born in a tent during a sandstorm. Others swore she'd gone further, south maybe, to the mountains in Mexico, to teach the same ideas to shepherds who knew the cold in a different way. One trader said she died near the Great Salt Lake, buried in a storm so vast that the sand turned to ice mid-air. He claimed to have seen her hut half buried in salt, the shape unmistakable. But no one ever found that hut. No one ever proved a thing. And back in Evermore, they didn't bother chasing the tale, because she had never been about spectacle, not about credit or applause. Her power had always come from the opposite of that, from knowing and building and waiting until the world came around to understand her. So instead of mythologizing her, they remembered her by doing the work. Each year, just before the first frost, a dozen young men and women walked the valley with bundles of goat hair, clay, bent steel, and scavenged stove parts. They'd stop at every new home, inspect it, offer suggestions, teach the math, explain the curve. They never forced anything. They just showed what they knew. They were called the Curve Keepers, and they had no leader, just a tradition. Each of them carried a waxed paper drawing rolled and tied in sinew, an original of Martha's last bundle, the one with the improved design, and the quiet note at the bottom: keep going, it matters. They treated that page like scripture, and long after her name faded from most tongues, the huts kept rising, in Kansas, in Utah, in Wyoming, in abandoned rail camps and snow-choked mines, in orphan settlements and canyon-bottom towns where the sun barely broke the cliffs. One by one, the curves appeared, like echoes of a woman too quiet to argue and too stubborn to die in a square cabin. 23 years passed. Children who'd once cried through the first long freeze were now grown, married, raising their own. The valley looked different now, still wild, still steeped in snow for half the year, but dotted with metal curves that hummed with heat through the coldest nights. The original hut still stood, empty, unchanged, weathered but strong. It had never been moved, never been sold. They'd offered once, early on, to turn it into a museum. Reardon, before his death, had argued for it, said people should see what she'd done. But when the first saw cut into the side to open up a window for display, The townsfolk gathered and stopped it. "This place isn't for looking into," Mrs. Wilker had said. "It's for remembering." So they resealed the seam, left the hut be. It became something else. Not quite a shrine, but not common ground either. When a child was born, sometimes a parent would take them to lay a hand on the curved wall. When someone died, they'd leave a stone at the door. Not flowers, not prayers, just a stone, round if they could find one. A silent marker of thanks. Then one June, the snow melted faster than usual. The ground turned to warm mud, the streams ran full, and Evermore's elders decided it was time to dig a new foundation for the school's addition. It had outgrown its shell. They needed another room, more space for the coming generation. They broke soil in the southeast corner. 3 feet down, they struck something hard. Metal, curved, but too deep to be part of the foundation. They kept digging, cleared dirt with hands, brushes, slow care. What they uncovered was a second hut, smaller, buried, no doors, no pipe, just the same unmistakable shape, pressed into the earth like a seed. Inside, once they found the seam and pried it open, was a single item, a book, hand-bound, leather-worn smooth. Inside were sketches, notes, observations, but not about heat, not about structures. They were letters, dozens of them, to no one, from no one, each dated, each written in a patient, looping hand. Most began with, "I wonder if they'll understand someday," or "They mocked me today, but it doesn't matter." And once, "It hurts less now," not the hands, the silence. The very last page bore no drawing, no explanation, just a line. "I built warmth into the cold. Let that be enough." They didn't display the book. They sealed the hut again, left it underground, marked the spot, and built the new schoolroom just beside it. When asked why, the schoolmaster said, "Roots don't need to be dug up to grow." And so the winters came, the snow fell, children were born under curved ceilings and kissed by heat that never left the floor. Men who once sneered at strange designs lived long enough to see their great-grandchildren sleep safely in round rooms. Women who once packed rags in every corner to fight the wind now taught others to weld the ribs that would bend the storm itself. And across the West, the warmth spread, the shape spread, the idea that knowledge could be quiet, survival could be stubborn, and sometimes the future arrives shaped like a half-buried steel shell, never left. In Evermore, they still tell it plain. They don't say she was a prophet, or an engineer, or a saint. They just say, "There was a widow who built a hut. We laughed, then we lived." And every time the snow begins to fall, someone, somewhere builds another. Round, silent, warm.